Part 21. Pit Stop. Outside La Mesa, California, 4:16 a.m. The Terminator drove tirelessly, at a steady rate, a human-shaped cruise control. Sarah was still puzzling out what she'd just heard, calmer now, focused. The strategic Sarah kicking in 100%. This T-1000, what happens when you shoot it? Ballistic penetration hydrostatically shocks it, but only for a few seconds. Based on recent observation, it can liquefy its molecular structure to allow bullets to pass through, or to alter its appearance. Can it be destroyed? Unknown. However, there is a high probability that when the T-1000 hardens its structure to make weapons or to enter into combat, its molecular structure becomes brittle. It would be most vulnerable then to a concussive shockwave. They rode along in silence for a few moments, then Sarah saw something up ahead, lonely neon in the blackness. Pull in here, we have to ditch this car. The Terminator drove into a run-down benthic petroleum gas station with a buzzing neon sign and no one around. They slowly cruised past the empty office. A sign in the window read, "Closed Sunday." They continued around the building to the garage's back door. The Terminator got out and, in an abrupt gesture, broke the lock on the roll-up door and lifted it. Sarah slid over and steered the security car in, out of sight. The Terminator rolled the door down behind them. For a moment, they were as close to safe as they could be. Sarah switched on an overhead drop light. She and the Terminator looked at one another. He was shot up and bleeding. She had a vicious slash on her right shoulder, and her tank top was soaked with blood. "You look like handmade shit," she said. The Terminator projected the words onto a screen and ran through the file for contextual definitions of the colloquial vernacular. A list appeared. "Fuck you, Jack. Kiss my ass. You're no beauty yourself. I'm okay, you're okay." In a microsecond, the Terminator selected the last entry and said it aloud. "So do you." Sarah almost smiled. Almost. A few minutes later, they had broken out the first aid kit from the office, some none too oily rags and a bottle of rubbing alcohol, and a few small tools. John watched the Terminator set down a bloody rag and handed him a clean one. Sarah was sitting on an empty crate beside the cyborg. He was suturing her wound with some fine wire they had taken from the winding of an alternator. It was glowing a dull red from the makeshift sterilizing process. The Terminator had held it in front of a butane cutting torch for a few minutes before beginning. She remembered what Kyle had told her so long ago, that pain could be controlled, compartmentalized, subdued, so that you could go on with your mission. Kyle's face began to form in her memory, bringing with it the old emotional ache, and that might incapacitate her mind when she most needed it. She slammed a door on the face and kept hold of the concept of controlling pain as she turned back to her arm. Using a pair of needle-nose pliers, the Terminator threaded the wire through her pale skin with machine precision. She had a little trouble finding compartments for all the pain. The Terminator picked up the slightest wince in her face and mechanically adjusted what he was doing to alleviate her discomfort. She felt the pain lessen, but even if she knew what the cyborg had done, she wouldn't have thanked him. He said something intended to reduce her stress and lower her heart rate, thereby reducing the loss of blood. "I have detailed files on human anatomy." It didn't quite work. Sarah stared into his face, inches away, her pulse still raging with barely suppressed hostility. She didn't like him being this close to her to begin with, let alone carving on her. "I'll bet. Makes you a more efficient killer, right?" The Terminator said, "Correct." He continued to stitch. John was watching, grateful to the Terminator for tending to his mother, but wondering why she could see only the dark side of the cyborg. After all, it was just a tool, wasn't it, programmed by himself in the future to protect them now. The Terminators weren't inherently evil, they just were. It was how you used them, sort of like a gun. He wanted to explain this to Sarah, but she didn't seem anywhere near in the mood. A few minutes later, it was the cyborg's turn. The leather jacket was riddled with bullet holes. Sarah and John pulled it off, revealing the Terminator's broad, muscular back underneath, marred with a dozen oozing holes. There were other wounds on the backs of his arms and his legs. Fortunately, they were all 9mm. The entry wounds were small, and the damage only cosmetic. "Does it hurt?" John asked. "I sense the injuries. The data could be called pain." Sarah started washing out the bullet holes in his back with the alcohol, flashing back to a cold night in a drainage culvert when she'd clumsily dressed the wound of a young man. It had been her first field dressing. He had complimented her, and that face again, finding other doorways to her heart. She slammed them all. It was much worse agony to do that than the throbbing in her now bandaged arm, but it was necessary. She fumbled for words to help her back to the grim here and now. "Will these heal up?" "Yes." "Glad to hear it, because if you can't pass for human, you won't be much good to us." She reached into the bloody wounds with pliers and found the copper-jacketed bullets, flattened against his armoured endoskeleton, and pulled them out. They clinked one by one into a glass. John was now realizing just what they were dealing with. A man-machine who could take point-blank bullet hits and walk around to tell about it was essentially like, well, immortal. He asked, "How long do you live? Last?" 120 years on my existing power cell, under normal conditions." Sarah pulled out the last few slugs. The glass was nearly full of flattened bullets. Then she started to sew the holes closed with the wire sutures. John watched in quiet amazement. Two warriors calmly fixing each other. "Can you learn so you can be, more human? And not such a dork all the time?" "My CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer. But Skynet presets the switch to read only when we are sent out alone." "Doesn't want you thinking too much, huh?" There was no irony in his reply, only fact. "No." "Hey, can we reset the switch?" Sarah looked at the Terminator, arching an eyebrow. "Yes," the cyborg answered. After the Terminator gave her preliminary access instructions, Sarah found an X-Acto knife and was now cutting into the Terminator's scalp, at the crown of his skull. His voice was even and unaffected by her ministrations as he directed her to spread the bloody incision and locate the maintenance port for the CPU in the chrome skull beneath. "Now, open the port cover." John used a rag to dab away some of the excess blood. Sarah used the garage mechanic's compressed air driver to unscrew the port cover. The Terminator saw a digitized image as he watched her work in a mirror that John had taken from the washroom. Her hands were covered with his blood as she waited for further instructions. "Hold the CPU by its base tab. Pull." She reached in with a pair of tweezers and gingerly pulled out a shock mount, then went deeper into the cyborg's skull. She carefully clipped the base tab of the CPU and lifted it out of its socket. The Terminator saw a burst of static, then blackness. John and Sarah were looking at what she had removed, a reddish-brown ceramic rectangle with a connector on one end, about the size and the shape of a domino. On close inspection, it appeared to be made up of small cubes connected together, identical to the shattered one in the vault at Cyberdyne Systems. Now they knew what Miles Dyson was still trying to figure out. This was the brain of a Terminator. John walked around the Terminator and looked at his face. He was completely inert. No chest movement, no twitches. Eyes open. Dead. Experimentally, John lifted his huge hand. The servos whined sullenly as he forced them through their range of motion. It was like moving a limb on a corpse, suffering from rigor mortis. He released the hand, and it stayed in the lifted position. It was clear to John that this was the most vulnerable anyone was likely to ever see a Terminator. They could have begun disassembly, taken the machine man apart until it was reduced to its basic components, just so much scrap heap. But the Terminator had allowed them to take out his brain and completely disable it. That showed a lot of trust. Or, John wondered, can machines trust? Sarah studied the CPU chip under the nearby lamp. "Do you see the pin switch?" John asked. She ignored him, looking at the Terminator with cold eyes, then back at the chip. What she felt was more than justified. It wasn't strategically smart. It wasn't particularly necessary. The Terminator was already out of action. But the emotion was so strong and irrational that before John knew what she was doing, she had set the chip on the work table and picked up a small sledgehammer. As she raised it to strike, John realized her intentions and dove at her. "No!" He protectively slapped his hand over the chip. That was the only thing that could have checked her swing. Sarah could barely stop the sledge before smashing his fingers. "Out of the way, John! No! Don't kill him! It, John. Not him. It. All right, it! But we need it!" John kept his hand right where it was. "We're better off by ourselves. But it's the only proof we have of the future, about the war and all that." Sarah hesitated. The boy was right. But she was still enveloped in loathing for the duplicate of the thing that had killed Kyle Reese. "I don't trust it. These things are hard to kill, John. Believe me. I know. We may never have this opportunity again. Look, Mom, if I'm supposed to ever be this great leader, you should start listening to my leadership ideas once in a while. Because if you won't, nobody else will." Another good point. A sliver of pride in her son slid in between her rage and the helpless Terminator. John realized that he and his mother were at a turning point. He could see it in her eyes. For years, he had been trying desperately to keep up with her program, to fit the mold she had made for him. Until this moment. He had despaired of ever pleasing her. Now, he felt the power shifting subtly between them. There was a confusion and uncertainty in her eyes that John had never seen before, and he had just put it there. He was right, and she knew it. So he slowly took his hand away from the chip, then stepped back. It was her choice now. John had taken another step towards becoming John Connor, for in his wisdom, he had done the right thing. Sarah's fury was still at a high pitch. Her head said lower the hammer. Her heart said smash it down. So she did. An inch away from the CPU. "All right, we'll do it your way." John palmed the chip and examined it carefully, his forehead furrowing with a child's intense scrutiny. He found what he was looking for and picked up a safety pin, using it to move the almost invisible switch to the other position, putting the CPU in the right mode. Grimacing, he gingerly inserted the wafer circuit back into the slot in the Terminator's blood-spattered skull. Out of a timeless blackness, light flared back to life in just another burst of static. To the Terminator, it had just been a single glitch, his consciousness otherwise uninterrupted. He could see the digitized images of Sarah and John standing behind him in the mirror. It didn't feel any different. Internal scans indicated no damage. All systems were nominal. Except his time clock indicated more time had passed than was necessary to complete the task. Was there a problem? The Terminator asked them. John glanced sheepishly at Sarah, then smiled at the cyborg. No problem. None whatsoever. A few hours later, Sarah sat in the dark, cross-legged, her back against the wall, the 45 cradled in her lap. She was watching her son, who was in a deep sleep, lying on the rear seat of the security car. The sleep of children was depthless. All the horrors of the day turned into a manageable monster or fun adventure. Never had she so desperately wanted to sleep like that. She ached all over, and when she moved, her joints felt like they had been filled with sand. She needed a good solid meal and 20 hours of totally dreamless sleep. But her eyes were wide open, as long as the Terminator was with them. He was standing at the office window, in a slash of moonlight, silent and still, watching the night. A maniacal mannequin. Only his eyes moved, tracking the occasional car passing on the road. Faithful machine sentinel. He seemed to grow lighter, glowing as the reflection of another car's headlights passed. But then Sarah realized he wasn't the only thing getting brighter. The whole room was filling with light. Thinking a car was turning in, she jolted upright, hand tensing around the 45. Then she realized it wasn't a car. It was morning. I must have dozed off, she thought with horror. That damn machine is still standing in exactly the same position. It could have done anything while I was out. Sarah's self-reprimand was harsh. She had only lightly dozed out of sheer exhaustion, but her brain was so attuned to danger. Had the Terminator moved 1 inch, she would have known. She wouldn't have been able to do very much about it, but she would have known. She struggled to get to her feet, wincing at the pain in her arm. It would hurt like this for weeks, and those compartments were all filled up. Steeling herself, she limped over to John and nudged him awake. His eyes fluttered open, and he saw the silhouette of his mother bending over him in the pre-dawn gloom. He began to smile with a child's joy, until she leaned into a shaft of light, and he saw how ravaged and hard she had become. It melted into a sleepy scowl as he heard her low, toneless voice, not so far from sounding like the Terminator's, say, "It's getting light. We have to get moving." John and the Terminator walked to an old Chevy station wagon parked behind the garage. The sun was cresting the horizon in a cloudless sky. The air was crisp and churlish, the wind whipping at their clothes and hair. Dust devils chased themselves across the land. It was going to be a long, hot day. The station wagon was locked, so the Terminator broke the side window with his fist and casually opened the door. They climbed in, and the Terminator used his servo-driven steel hand to smash the cowl around the steering column with one blow. When it shattered, he stripped it away with a single move, then turned the stub of the lock mechanism with his fingertips. By the time John had reached up for the sun visor, the engine was already running. John flipped the visor down, and a set of keys dropped into his lap. He grinned and dangled them in front of the Terminator's eyes. "Are we learning yet?" The Terminator said nothing, but internally he was doing something he had never done before. In the past, he had cross-referenced new data, finding a contextual meaning and filing it in memory. But this was a subtle difference. The Terminator was only dimly aware of the difference. But the location of the keys, the human motivation to hide an extra set there, and the undermeanings of that motivation created an almost organic melding of these knowledges into an expanded awareness, unlike any recording of new data he had ever previously experienced in his short life. He reran the data back and forth, analysing it with a small part of his brain, while the other tended to driving the truck alongside the pumps and filling the gas tank to the top. Sarah walked out of the station office. She'd found a mechanic's jacket to hide the blood on her tank top inside, used but fairly clean. It didn't fit too well, but it was better than the stuff from the hospital. She was still barefooted. The sun hurt her eyes. She'd always seen it through smoked, barred, wire-meshed windows. It had been so long since she had stood in its full light, out in the open, with the wind in her hair. She wanted to feel free. Instead, she felt dangerously exposed. The Terminator and John pulled up in the station wagon. As she climbed in next to her son, the Terminator made his first pronouncement of the day. "We need to get as far from the city as possible." Sarah was for that. She knew this escape path. She had plotted a dozen over the years. She looked down the highway as it converged into the horizon. "Just keep heading south," she said.